a precarious future in the face of climate catastrophe. And in the second half of this talk, I'll talk about rebellion. I will present you with the social science of what enables change to happen in the world and ask you to act accordingly. So before we go any further, let us pause to acknowledge the land that we are on, namely the unceded traditional territory of the Musqueam First Nation. This acknowledgement has a particularly profound resonance tonight, as we talk about and contemplate the very future of life on Earth. From time immemorial to the present, Indigenous peoples around the world have been deeply conscientious and resilient stewards of the home that we share with all living things. We acknowledge that when we talk about climate change, we are talking about only the latest assault on Indigenous ways of life that began with colonial invasion hundreds of years ago. Indigenous peoples have seen the end of their worlds already and survived. Today, the survivors stand on the front lines of the climate emergency, leading the fight to defend the natural world for generations to come. So, who am I and why am I here today and why are you here? So my name is Laura. Like I said, I'm a student. I'm finishing up my degree right now at UBC in integrated engineering. When I first started this program, I was looking for solutions on the climate crisis. I was hoping to find some kind of technological solution to fix what's going on in the world. However, during my degree, I realized that most of the technological solutions actually exist, and it's mainly the social and political processes that are holding us back from transformative change. On a more personal level, I remember maybe 2 years ago, it was the time of the initial school strike for the climate marches that were going on worldwide. And I wasn't really going to them. I wasn't really doing anything. And I remember seeing some pictures of Bernie Sanders doing civil disobedience during the civil rights movement. And I thought to myself, you know, if I was alive back then, I would have been doing that too. And then I looked at myself in the mirror and thought, well, this is happening right now. And I'm at home on the couch chilling out. So that's basically why I'm here. So we want you to tell us why you're here. So what we're going to do is just put people into breakout rooms with just one other person and have a quick conversation just about what brought you to this talk today. So Sarah is going to set that up. Thanks, everyone. So the way we've been trained to talk about the climate and ecological emergency for years now is to be optimistic and to focus on hopeful ways forward. But this runs the danger of creating a false sense of security instead of clearly facing our situation as it is. So I won't do that today. I am going to be guided by this core Extinction Rebellion principle, to tell the truth and act as if the truth is real. Since pre-industrial times, the planet is already, on average, about 1 degree warmer. Next slide, please. It's worth emphasizing that Canada is warming at twice the average rate. And this does not go unnoticed. At 1 degree of warming, we've seen smoke and wildfires choke out the west coast of North America, Australia, the Amazon. We've seen floods engulf full cities. 8 million people die annually from air pollution. Climate change is not on our doorsteps, but it is fully inside the house. It is a fact that this is due to human activity. Pre-industrial concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide was 280 parts per million. In 2021, Earth's atmosphere passed 417 parts per million of carbon dioxide for the first time in millions of years. No human being has ever existed on a planet like this. So who is the IPCC? The IPCC is a cross-border body from the United Nations of climate scientists who assess thousands of papers each year to provide governments and policymakers with comprehensive summaries. These are the guys that told us we now have 9 years left to slash emissions in half. The conclusions that survive this process of academic review are rigorous. So this is mainstream, non-controversial science. This can be considered fact. So when analyzing these reports, it's essential to consider them as scientifically conservative. This report looked at the difference between the impacts of 1.5 degrees of warming versus 2 degrees of warming. It concludes that 1.5 degrees of warming is really bad, but 2 degrees temperature rise is much, much worse. The difference between the impacts of these two temperatures is extreme, and we really need to keep the warming to 1.5. But the thing is, 1.5 isn't a safe level either. We still see dangerous impacts of climate change at that level. It will require massive global adjustments and result in massive global conflicts and loss of life, human and otherwise. So Dr. Deborah Roberts, she's the co-chair of the IPCC Impacts Group. She said, "It is a line in the sand, and what it says to our species is that this is the moment, and we must act now. The next few years are probably the most important in our history." So let's take a look into our future. On this graph of IPCC data, the black line is showing you the emissions that have happened so far, and I'm just going to talk you through the 3 scenarios of what could potentially happen next. Scenario 1. So this is my dream scenario. We stop all of our emissions right now. Warming doesn't stop immediately. There's a lag, but this takes us to between 1.3 and 1.7 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So this is only a pipe dream of mine. So let's go to scenario number 2. Let's actually keep all of the promises we've made around the world to tackle climate change, including the pledges with the Paris Agreement. In this scenario, we see warming of around 3 degrees by the end of the century. At this level of warming, Southern Europe is in permanent drought. We see massive crop failure, starvation. Arctic sea ice is gone. Sea level rise is drowning cities from Shanghai to Miami. Extreme heat waves are decimating populations. Billions will starve. And this is currently our best case optimistic policies scenario. Okay, so let's explore scenario number 3, business as usual, if we don't do anything. So if we do that, which is indicated by the gray area of this chart here, we are on track for more than 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century. According to the IPCC, as much as 6 degrees. Science can barely comprehend the catastrophic impacts at that level of warming. Think about the human body. 37 degrees is a normal body temperature. And we've all probably experienced a fever around 39, which completely sucks. But sustained above 41 degrees, this goes from debilitating to fatal. And that is the very future that we're racing towards on a planetary scale. Now, these three scenarios that I just described are what we expect to see based on our emissions. But do we always see what we expect with climate change? Let's explore the known and the unexpected. Permafrost. So you may have seen recently on the news that permafrost, which is ground that stays frozen for at least 2 years in the Canadian Arctic, is melting at levels and depths not expected by the IPCC until 2090. That's 70 years ahead of schedule. Arctic sea ice. This graph is showing you the total area of sea ice in the Arctic. So the black line shows the average expected decline in sea ice, and the red line shows what's been observed. So for several years, we saw data right on track with what the IPCC projected. But in a few years, what was actually observed dropped off significantly, significantly lower than even the worst range of IPCC projections. So why are we seeing things that we don't expect with climate change? Let's explore feedback loops and tipping points. So let's take a look at the Albedo Effect. This is an example of a feedback loop. This is what happens when you go outside wearing a black t-shirt and you get way hotter than if you were in a white t-shirt. In this case, as the climate warms, ice melts. So this white reflective surface is replaced with something super dark and absorbent. Ocean water then takes up more heat. We see more ice melting, and then we enter this vicious cycle as a feedback loop. And this causes the process of sea ice melt to accelerate. Another example of a feedback loop is the weakening of natural carbon sinks. These are the forests and other ecosystems that naturally take up carbon and slow down climate change. So let's take a look at a Canadian example. Canada's boreal forests alone hold about 12% of the world's land-based carbon reserves. But Canada's forests have not been a net carbon sink since 2001. Climate change has weakened the ability of our natural sinks to absorb as much carbon as they are pumping out. Forests are drying out. They are increasingly disappearing from logging and wildfires, and they're being attacked more and more by insects which thrive in the warmer, drier conditions that we are creating. The image on the left and the bottom right are a forest right here in British Columbia. All of the red that you can see in these photos here is forest killed by a single species of beetle. In its worst year, this outbreak caused more carbon dioxide emissions than 40 years of wildfires across Canada. So, in addition to these feedback loops that are hard to project, we also have the complete unknowns, the total surprises that are out there for us. And we've all experienced a lot of surprises in the past year. This is a paper that was published in February of 2019 that looks at an extreme scenario. It's looking at business as usual in terms of our emissions for about another century. So carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere would get so high that cloud banks, which are large expanses of cloud, disperse abruptly. This would add an extra 8 degrees of warming on top of the warming that we would expect to see as a result of emissions by that point. 8 degrees. So this scenario is extreme, and I'm not sharing it because I think it's going to happen, but I'm sharing it with you because I think it's a very important reminder that as we create this increasingly unfamiliar world, there are going to be surprises. And as the scientist says, those surprises are probably not going to be pleasant. So let's take a look at tipping points. Tipping points are the idea that climate change reaches a threshold after which some of those impacts completely run away from us. These are the points of no return. So there may not just be feedback loops, but domino cascades of feedback loops. So what does all of this mean for where we could be heading based on our emissions? A paper came out recently that said The idea of holding to 2 degrees Celsius within the lifetime of people born today is highly unlikely. In fact, we've got a 1% chance of hitting the 1.5 degrees target, and only a 5% chance that temperatures will be less than 2 degrees. The likely range is between 2 and almost 5 degrees. We can't treat these ranges of uncertainty as safety nets. And because of feedback loops, changes will not be linear and will start happening faster and faster. We know we've already gotten way off the map in terms of the climate that we know. And as we head further and further into this gray area that you see on this graph here, we know less and less about what we are getting ourselves into. Having said that, there are some things that we do know about what we're getting ourselves into. Sea level rise. So sea level rise is something that we all hear about, especially here, where less than half a degree more of warming will see large parts of the lower mainland, Richmond, parts of Coquitlam, and rural Abbotsford, underwater, as visualized in the graphic on the top right. The IPCC report confirms that sea level rise is now unstoppable. Seas will continue to rise over the coming centuries, no matter what action we take on emissions. It will affect upwards of 1 billion people. This map shows the size of populations that will be affected by sea level rise around the world. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, is already sinking at 17 centimeters annually. The government conceded defeat and announced plans to relocate 10 million people to Borneo as early as 2024. And these people are headed to Borneo, which is already somewhere that has a high chance of being impacted by climate change. The 21st century will see more migration than ever before. Where will these people go? We're also losing lands to desertification as temperatures continue to rise, and particularly as we see more variable, unpredicted rainfall, it will become increasingly hard to grow crops in many parts of the world. This graph from the UN's annual food security report is showing global hunger, which had been steadily declining for years, but is now on the rise since 2016. The number of people facing chronic food deprivation has increased by 60 million since 2014. And the report cites climate change as a key driver of this increase. That's 60 million people. That's more than the population of Canada. And that is at 1 degree of warming. Migration and hunger. We only need to think about the last few years to imagine the kind of political and social consequences of this and the enormous human cost. When we're talking about the victims of climate change and ecological breakdown, of course, we're not only talking about other people, but also other species. These plants and animals shown here are all among those threatened with extinction right now, in Canada and around the world. The WWF Living Planet report showed that just since the 1970s, we'd wiped out nearly 60% of animal populations. Then, this year, a landmark UN report was released that warned 1 million species may be pushed to extinction in the next few years. This is unfathomable. We are in the 6th mass extinction. In an extinction crisis, the apex predator, us, are the most vulnerable because the things they depend on disappear. The essential interconnected web of life on Earth is getting smaller and smaller. So in this sense, mainstream Western science is only just catching up with what Indigenous peoples have known for centuries. In fact, we largely have Indigenous peoples to thank for the fact that we have even survived this long. 80% of the world's biodiversity is located on Indigenous lands and territories. Inuit activist Sila Wa Cloutier has witnessed firsthand the magnitude of the disappearing Arctic sea ice. Our sea ice, which had allowed for safe travel for our hunters and provided a strong habitat for our mammals is deteriorating. The human fatalities that have been caused by thinning ice, the animals that may face extinction, the crumbling coastlines, the communities that we're having to relocate. In other words, the many ways that our rights to life, health, property, and a means of subsistence are being violated by a dramatically changing climate. As Leanne Betsamasak Simpson of the Nishnabeg Nation in the Great Lakes region says, Indigenous peoples have witnessed continual ecosystem and species collapse since the early days of colonial occupation. We should be thinking of climate change as a part of a much longer series of ecological catastrophes caused by colonialism and accumulation-based society. So as much as we are habituated to only believing what can be represented by graphs, charts, and facts, how much more of this overwhelming evidence do we really need before we can act on this crisis unfolding before our eyes? As the climate crisis escalates and the world gets warmer, the stresses fall unevenly on those who are already the most oppressed. This is true nationally and internationally. As with any crisis, marginal populations will be worse off. Children, people with chronic disease, people living in inadequate housing or already struggling from food insecurity. Indigenous communities, especially. This is already happening. And this is a key point. The climate crisis is not just about numbers on a screen. It's about the human cost and the cost to all living things. The climate crisis is the great social justice issue of our time, the issue that connects just about every other form of injustice today. And until we recognize this, we cannot get more serious about action. So let's take a moment to think about how the current pandemic has turned everyone's life around. And we've seen worldwide how it's already exacerbated already existing social issues. The pandemic has fallen disproportionately on marginalized groups, those who can't afford to isolate, are essential workers, and Black, Hispanic, and Asian communities have faced higher death rates than their white counterparts. I can recognize that the momentum from the climate fight has died down since this emergency. But with the climate crisis left untreated, it is highly unlikely that this will be the only pandemic that we see in our lifetimes. As deforestation and climate change forces animals out of natural habitats, illnesses spread significantly more easily. About 60% of new pathogens come from animals, and about 1/3 of those can be directly attributed to changes in human land use. The way this pandemic has shaken everyone's lives is only the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we're facing in our lifetimes. Mass migrations, crop failures, depleted resources, and relentless disasters. These are the conditions that lead to social collapse. All over the world, right-wing authoritarian governments are rising to power on the backs of people's desperate discontent with inequality and poverty. Imagine what could happen when up to 1 billion climate refugees are on the move, when wealthy, energy-rich countries start hoarding resources for themselves, with the threat of starvation looming. From here on out, circumstances will bolster the forces of reaction. The space for addressing climate change in a cooperative, mutually beneficial way is rapidly shrinking. This crisis is in effect, yet our society puts it on the back burner. So let's come to this question that we were posed with at the title of this talk. Could climate change and ecological breakdown possibly be enough to wipe out humanity? A paper published in PNAS in 2017 looked at this question. It looked at low probability, high impact climate change scenarios, including those where climate change is a complete existential threat. Those are scenarios with a probability of happening of 5%. I'm just going to read you a quote from one of the authors of this paper to put this into context. When we say 5% probability high impact event, people might dismiss it as small, but it is equivalent to a 1 in 20 chance that the plane that you are about to board will crash. We would never get on that plane with a 1 in 20 chance of it coming down, but we are willing to send our children and our grandchildren onto that plane. This is a lot. So at this point, we're just going to take a minute of complete quiet to absorb some of what we've talked about so far. Whatever feelings you're experiencing, I encourage you to sit with them. We hope that this next part will give you some courage, but it is also normal to continue to experience these feelings of panic, grief, or anger in waves for quite some time. We encourage you to take the time you need to process this and to know that there are many others facing the same reality and to seek them out for support. Facing this grief takes tremendous courage. It requires a massive shift of consciousness away from the narcissistic, consumerist culture of me first to one of accepting that this is a time for mourning the future that we thought we had. At the same time, it asks us to step into service and to be willing to do the things that might just make the difference. I strongly believe that action is the antidote to worry. Our governments have failed us. So I think we can all agree from the previous slides that this is an emergency on an unprecedented level and we need to take action. But our political representatives are taking measures which are actively worsening it, like giving $3.3 billion in subsidies for big oil each year, bailing out oil giant Kinder Morgan with $4.5 billion taxpayer dollars to buy their failed pipeline expansion project, or like pushing a $40 billion LNG pipeline through Wet'suwet'en territory in northern British Columbia. And they know that they are failing. In its own 2018 climate audit, Canada admitted to missing the 1992 Rio emission reductions target, as well as the 2005 Kyoto Protocol targets, which we shamefully withdrew from in 2012. We're on track to miss the 2020 Copenhagen targets, and we're nowhere near the ballpark of our 2030 Paris targets. We are on track to meet our 2050 target by the year 2961. Yes, nearly 1,000 years too late. Here's a report released by Environment Canada and Climate Change Canada, part of the federal government. It's the first in a series called Canada and a Changing Climate, Advancing Our Knowledge for Action. You can see in the headline statements copied here, they already know everything that we just told you. So how is any of this knowledge being advanced for action? How are they acting in any way as if this information is real? We got our answer in 2019. On June 17th, the Prime Minister declared a national climate emergency, and the very next day approved the Trans Mountain Pipeline Expansion Project. In response to environmental concerns, the best Trudeau can do is assure us that the project will fund Canada's future clean economy. So-called Canada has promised targets and goals that, as stated before, are nothing more than forlorn. That just about sums up the state of climate inaction and ecocidal hypocrisy in Canada. Our government is trying to tell us that we can be serious about the climate and still increase fossil fuel extraction, that you don't need to make hard choices. And that's simply not true. We absolutely need to make those choices. This is a study that was published in Nature. It explains that globally existing infrastructure already commits us to overshooting our remaining emissions budget for keeping to 1.5 Celsius, that line in the sand that the IPCC has drawn. And if we include all planned and in progress projects, that number jumps to 190 billion tons, even higher. Just over 1/3 of that development is set to happen in Canada. We are locking in the loss of billions of lives. We have to face reality. There has been a tremendous lack of concrete action. The graph on the left shows you the increase in greenhouse gases globally. When the first IPCC report came out in 1990, 29 years ago, the UN warned us to keep temperature rises to 1 degree Celsius or face societal collapse. Carbon dioxide levels are 60% higher than they were in 1990, and they're still rising, methane even more so. So we have to conclude that around the world, existing political processes have systemically failed to deliver for people or the planet. What is an appropriate response in this situation when normal channels aren't working? Rebellion. We believe that we must rebel. Now, rebellion is often associated with revolutions and with the left, but we want to be clear. Climate change is a threat to the values and lives of everyone, no matter your political persuasion. Political theorists from Locke to Hobbes agree. When the government fails to protect its citizens, the bonds of the social contract are null and void, and thus rebellion is completely justified. So we have told you the truth about the climate science. Now, we're going to take a look at the science of social change. What actually enables change to happen in the world? So up to this point, most of the campaigning and action around climate change has looked something like this: sending emails, giving money to charity, and going on marches. Many exceptional, inspirational people have dedicated years of their lives to these things. But it's time to be honest. It has failed to bring about the necessary change and is no longer an appropriate response to an issue that is existential. Yet, we continue to act as if we can personally recycle our way out of this or buy enough bamboo toothbrushes to save the world. This approach that focuses on the individual fundamentally ignores that there are powerful systems in place generating this crisis and powerful forces actively trying to stop change from happening. The term carbon footprint was created by the oil and gas industry to shift the blame from governments and corporations onto you, the individual. You cannot overcome such entrenched power with emails and petitions. We need a new approach. And that approach is rebellion. But what do we mean by rebelling? This is what we mean by rebellion. Strategic Nonviolent Direct Action, or NVDA. A major system of resistance based upon the assumption that hierarchical systems can be modified or destroyed by withdrawal of submission, cooperation, and obedience. So there are 4 key principles of strategic NVDA, particularly Extinction Rebellions. So first of all, it must be respectful. Nonviolence isn't just limited to not punching someone in the face. It's actually something much more profound than that. There is a word in Sanskrit, ahimsa, which we translate as nonviolence, but it more accurately means a state of such open-heartedness that there is no room for hatred. But also, on a more practical level, if you're respectful, people are much more likely to listen. Secondly, it's disruptive. The key lesson about all structural political change is this: disruption works. Without disruption, there's no economic cost, and without economic cost, the people running this world really don't care. That's why labor strikes are so effective against companies, and why closing down a capital city is so effective against governments. You have to hit them where it hurts, which is in their pockets. Third, it's sacrificial. If people see you striking and going to prison, or doing something where you're making a personal sacrifice, you get sympathy and you show that you're serious. And finally, it creates a backfiring response. By breaking the law, by sitting in the streets and disrupting business as usual, you're putting authorities in a lose-lose position. If they let you stay there, you get the publicity and people will see just how powerful you are. But if they opt for forcefully removing you, thousands of people will still see. So a movement that uses the principles of NVDA is highly organized and intentional. Successful civil disobedience involves tremendous and unglamorous effort and planning behind the scenes before anyone sets foot on the streets. Extinction Rebellion is based on overwhelming social science. This is Erica Chenoweth. She conducted research on all of the violent and non-violent uprisings since 1900, of which there were over 300. And she found that non-violent direct action is twice as likely to succeed as violent action. But also, most importantly, you don't need everybody. You don't even need 10% or 5%. She found that no government can withstand an uprising of 3.5% of the population. You need 3.5% of the population to rebel in order to change the system. At UBC, that's about 2,200 people. Across Canada, about 1.3 million. It's really not that many. An estimated 4 million people participated in the climate strike last September from Australia to Afghanistan. And right here in Vancouver, over 100,000 people were marching in the streets. Change is exponential. It can start with you, right here, right now. So let's look at some examples. This is a classic example, a successful movement that used the principles I outlined before, the American Civil Rights Movement. And they succeeded with far less than 3.5% of the population. One of the examples of the campaigns during this movement is the Freedom Riders. The Freedom Riders deliberately sat where they were not supposed to, on buses and trains. The movement started with 13 and ended with 4,400, with hundreds arrested. Within a year, that policy of segregated seating had changed. Another example, pretty close to home, is the so-called War in the Woods that took place during the summer of 1993 on the west coast of Vancouver Island. The threat of increased logging in the Coquitlam Sound brought together Indigenous groups and environmentalists in the largest act of peaceful civil disobedience in Canadian history. Over that summer, 12,000 protesters came out to blockade a logging road at the Kennedy River Bridge, with over 850 arrested and charged. They were successful in raising international awareness about the logging of old-growth temperate rainforests, and their actions led to numerous policy changes to protect large areas of these ancient forests. Current examples of nonviolent direct action can include the Black Lives Matter movement and the Indian farmer protests, both taking place this year. On June 6th alone, over 500,000 people showed up to 550 places across the US to protest racist police brutality. In India, on November 26th, an estimated 250 million people took part in the farmers' protests, the biggest nonviolent direct action in history. And these actions are still ongoing. From the people power movement that brought down an oppressive regime in the Philippines in 1986, to the Rose Revolution that ended a 30-year dictatorship in Georgia in 2003, from the War in the Woods to the arrest of more than 200 protesters in 2018 that forced Kinder Morgan to suspend operations on the TMX pipeline, we know that with enough people, nonviolent civil disobedience works. And Extinction Rebellion is doing this. In the UK, Extinction Rebellion issued a declaration of rebellion in October last year. In April, 10,000 turned out to shut down 5 key sites in central London in one of the biggest acts of peaceful disobedience in British history. Over 1,000 people were willfully arrested. Following the rebellion, the UK became the first country to issue a national declaration of climate emergency. More importantly, it was successful in spreading to over 57 countries. Last year, with Extinction Rebellion UBC, in order to get the university to divest their assets from the fossil fuel industry, 10 rebels put on a hunger strike, which ended up being successful to get UBC to make this formal commitment to full divestment. And let me say something about hunger strikes and getting arrested. To be clear, not everyone in this Zoom chat needs to go get arrested to save the planet or hunger strike, nor would we recommend it. Being able to willfully do these things is a privilege. But for some of us, it is a sacrifice that we can make and we are willing to make because we know that it will bring about change. So rebellion works. But how are we going to convince people to do this? So this has been the philosophy behind how we've talked about climate change for the past 30 years. If you're trying to motivate people to change, scaring the shit out of them is a really bad strategy. So this is a fair point if you're trying to motivate everyone. But what if you're not trying to motivate every single person? What if you're just looking for the 3.5%? This is a rough illustrative graph to show how people respond to knowing about climate change. On the two extreme ends, we have people who couldn't care less and people who care a whole lot. The majority think it's a good idea to look after the environment, but they're not really doing much about it. The idea is if you tell them and scare them, then this will happen. They'll go, oh my God, this is way too much. They'll run away, they'll distract themselves. But what if this actually isn't the case for everyone? You get a small bunch of people who go, this is the most important thing that anyone's ever told me. We're headed for 4 degrees of warming. We've got to do something about it. These people are called Upstanders, and they act differently for whatever reason. They have a different mindset, different values. Something has happened in their lives. Something makes them stand up and say, I'm going to rebel on behalf of the greater good. So it's a nice theory, but where's the evidence? The evidence is in the uprisings of people just like you in countries around the world who are faced with information like this and are now in the streets with Extinction Rebellion or the School Strikes for Future or the Indigenous-led resistance against TMX here in Vancouver and Burnaby. It is true that Upstanders will stand up. And you are all Upstanders. So I've told you why rebellion is necessary, why it works, and how we can get a percentage of the population to act. So what are we rebelling for? Extinction Rebellion actually has 4 demands, not just 3. So the 0th demand is a just transformation. Government must respond to the climate and ecological crisis with a just transformation that is actively decolonial, prioritizing the livelihoods of workers and the rights of those most oppressed by the present system, including our non-human relations. The first demand is to tell the truth. So the government must tell the truth by declaring a climate and ecological emergency, by working with other institutions to communicate the urgency for change. Governments conduct public health campaigns based on accurate scientific evidence all the time. Wear a seatbelt, don't drink and drive, smoking kills, wear a mask. And we're essentially asking for the same thing. We're saying tell the truth and give your citizens accurate information so that we can have mass behavior change. And also so they understand where we're going and what policies really need to be put in place. This will take a concerted effort between government, our major media institutions, and our education systems. Our second demand: government must act now to halt biodiversity loss and reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2025. This is pretty ambitious, but we go for what's necessary, not for what's possible. The IPCC says net zero by 2050, but we know from earlier slides that this is a conservative estimate. 60% of the models for the next IPCC report, due sometime this year, are already out, and they're shocking scientists because they're showing that things could be going almost twice as fast as the last report states. So we don't have time. Net carbon neutral in 4 years is quite the ask. So how would we actually do that? We think we can get there with the mobilization, like what happened in the Second World War. In World War II, countries transformed their entire economies within a matter of a few months to deal with an existential threat. Factories that were producing cars suddenly, within weeks, were producing something for the war effort. We have the historical precedent. We know that this is possible. And now it's just a matter of social and political will. However, there was a big downside, and that things weren't very democratic at all. And we're not looking for eco-fascism. And we know our governments are capable of doing this. For so long, we've heard arguments on how a transformative approach to our energy systems isn't economically feasible. The money simply doesn't exist to make it happen. In the face of the pandemic this year, governments globally pumped out more than $12 trillion to remedy it. In fact, papers have outlined that if the world spent 1/10 of what they did on the COVID-19 pandemic, then we would have real solutions to climate change right now. This year, we were able to react and cut out non-essential business to protect healthcare systems from being overwhelmed. Again, our economies were completely transformed. This can happen in the face of the climate crisis as well. Our third demand is beyond politics. Government must create and be led by the decisions of the Citizens' Assembly on climate and ecological justice. The Citizens' Assembly would be a decision-making body of about 100 randomly selected citizens, kind of like jury duty for the climate crisis. The members are presented the facts by experts who divulge their funding, and the decision-making process is rigorous and professionally facilitated. So the assemblies are representative, they understand the facts about climate change, and they make decisions in a thoughtful and fair manner. This random selection to fill political posts and assemblies is called sortition. It gets rid of party politics and short-term electoral thinking. Most of all, it gets away completely from the lobbying and corruption and power that the carbon-heavy industries have over our elected representatives and our system. So what's next? So we've talked about our strategy, our set of tactics, and our theory of change. The time to act is now. Like I said before, we are pushing for what is necessary, not for what is possible. So there is the upcoming Spring Rebellion, which will be happening on May 1st in Victoria. So essentially, this action will be preceded by some smaller actions going down in the Lower Mainland, which we'll provide information on before. But essentially, what will be happening is a lot of nonviolent direct action in Victoria in order to have these 4 demands met by our provincial government. So I'm not here today talking with you to sugarcoat things. And if you don't agree with what I've presented just now, I really want to ask you, what is your alternative? That degree that you've spent the past 4 years working on, that promotion that you've been waiting for, or that family that you so badly want to start. What is it all for if you have no future to exist in? This is the stark truth, that there might come a day in your lifetime when you go to the grocery store and there isn't food anymore. And even if this doesn't happen to you, it will happen to others worldwide. As I displayed before, starvation from climate change is already a reality for so many people. I have given you the cold, hard evidence that is in plain sight. We are looking at 4 degrees plus of warming, and the window by which we can act is closing day by day and minute by minute. And every minute that passes with inaction is one that is closer to human extinction. And if you came here for hope, I'm not here to give that to you either. I'm sorry. There's no guarantee that the worst won't happen, regardless of how many people join our rebellion. And this leads us to examine our deepest motivations. Do we only act when we know we're going to win? Or do we take action because we know it is the right thing to do? Finally, this is Kate Marvel. She's a top climate scientist with NASA, and here's her take. As a climate scientist, I'm often asked to talk about hope. Climate change is bleak, the organizers always say. Tell us a happy story. Give us hope. The problem is, I don't have any. What we need is courage. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. Extinction Rebellion is founded on courage and not on hope. Here's the analogy I've been using for a long time. Imagine the human species has had a final exam coming up for hundreds of years, but has failed to even crack open a book to study. The final is looming and things are looking pretty horrific. It's now the night before. Things really aren't looking good. But if we grind, pull an all-nighter, and give every last bit of effort that we have, there's a chance that we can pull it off by the skin of our teeth. And this is what I'm asking of you here today. Look deep inside yourself and ask, if you want to go through the rest of your life knowing that you were complicit in this crisis, or if you did everything that you possibly could to mitigate it. It's extinction or it's rebellion. I hope to see you all at our next action. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.